Hello, good morning. I'd like to begin the program today, and I apologize for doing that in English because this is going to be entirely in English, because it is also live streaming, and we can have Professor Woods understanding everything. So, good morning and welcome. On behalf of Insper, the Center of Leadership and Innovation of this school, and also the Lemann Foundation that helped organize this event, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Ngaire Woods. I will explain how this thing is going to go. My name is Patrícia Tavares. I'm faculty at this institution, and I was the inaugural Lemann Visiting Fellow of Practice at the School of Government, that place there. So somehow housekeeping first. Please turn off the ringers of your cell phone so you don't be interrupted in the minute. And Professor Woods is going to be talking for half an hour, something around that, and then we will have a Q&A part. We do have some assistants on the floor, so please write down your questions so we can try to organize all the questions, although she wants to know who asked the questions because it's very interesting to know who's asking. And after the Q&A part, Mariana from Fundação Lemann is going to explain how the scholarship program and all the schools that are partners work. And after that, she will invite me to tell you about my experience as a Lemann Fellow. So what happened at Oxford and also the benefits of being part of the Lemann network of fellows. After that, we'll proceed to the foyer for these finger food brunch so we can ask questions to all the Lemann Fellows that are present. They have these tags. Can you please just show hands where you are? Okay, they are here to give you more explanations regarding scholarships, the program, the schools, and also about Oxford, because all of them are from Oxford, right? So I'm really thrilled with this opportunity to have Professor Ngaire Woods, which is also the inaugural Dean of Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government. She has a research focus on global governance and challenges of globalization and also international institutions. She's going to be talking about integrity in public leadership and as a consequence of trust in government. So please let us give us a warm welcome to Professor Ngaire Woods. If you want to sit here or you want to sit there, you just
Maybe I'll stand.
okay.
Well, good morning, and what a pleasure to be back in Brazil, and to be here at Insper, a place of such outstanding research and teaching in both public policy and business economics and engineering. Brazil is fascinating for anybody interested in government. My knowledge only goes back to reading through some of Brazil's economic history from the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century. As a student of sovereign debt, Brazil was a very interesting case, but also an interesting case of a country, one of 3 or 4 countries in the world, which has very consistently striven to have a national strategy in a very proactive way. And it stands out in government that one of the challenges of government that most of the world's governments face is an absence of strategy, an absence of a national vision of where they're trying to head to. It's for you to tell me during the question time where Brazil is on that at the moment. But what I really wanted to do today was first to talk about the huge challenges that governments around the world are facing. Second, to point out the attack that most governments are under. And third, and most importantly, to talk about some of the reactions that governments are having to this very challenging time. It is a striking paradox that at a time of fairly unprecedented challenge, most governments in the world have been trying to downsize, they've been trying to downgrade government, and they've been downplaying 3 of the core values that underpin democratic government. And I'd like to talk about that, the downsizing, the downgrading, and the downplaying of the values underpinning government, to talk about why, before we all race to embrace a kind of Silicon Valley idea that we'd be better off run by Watson computers, we should think about what integrity in government means. And the dictionary definition of integrity has 3 elements. The first is about honesty and moral principles, to have integrity. The second is a state of being whole. When we talk about the integrity of the European Union being challenged by Brexit, we're talking about keeping something whole. And the third is about the quality. When we talk about the integrity of a ship, we're talking about the fact that it has no holes in its bottom and therefore it's unlikely to sink. And it's these 3 kinds of integrity that governments need. And what I'd like to do in today's conversation is to talk about how we might get there and whether we're on track to having government with more integrity in the 21st century or less. So what are these unprecedented challenges? I think every academic in every year of the world's history has probably said we face unprecedented challenges. But I think that there is a difference in quantum and in speed of the 3 challenges I want to put to you. And the first is the challenge of inequality, technology, and jobs. It's what happens when we extrapolate from the impact of technology on both jobs and inequality of wealth and income, and we project that into the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And how is it that as societies we'll deal with that? The G20 yesterday were talking about inclusive capitalism and inclusive global governance, but they've been talking about that since their formation. In fact, the G20 finance ministers back in 1997 entitled their meeting, Managing Globalization to Make It More Inclusive. And absent from those discussions is a really deep thinking about if technology displaces 50% of jobs in our society, what is our vision of how we hold society together, given that up until now, a job has been the ticket for entry into society? Welfare programs are benchmarked against how quickly they get somebody back into a job. But what if the jobs aren't there? What then is the challenge for government for holding societies together? The second challenge is around the environment, not just climate change, but food and water security. This is a challenge that's probably number 1 for China at the moment. It's one that increasingly we're aware is going to create flows of millions of refugees. And already the European Union is having great difficulty dealing with thousands of refugees, not millions. And the third is a challenge of global governance where, as one writer puts it, we're living in a global interregnum. There is a shift in global order going on where we're neither in the world of US hegemony, with the United States both willing and able to play hegemon to the system, nor are we in a world of a sort of stable balance of power. People hoped that the G20, the BRICS, the G7, China, the European Union, the United States, that all these different groupings would somehow come together in an equilibrating balance of power at the global governance level. But in the last 5 years, that looks to be elusive. And so there is a real challenge of how we take forward solutions to global problems. So governments have a big job to do. And it's right at this moment that they find themselves losing trust, hemorrhaging trust. If you look at the United States and the Pew Foundation figures in 1958, if we go back that far, 78% of Americans had trust that their government would mostly do the right thing. That's plummeted down to 19%. If we look at the Gallup work for the OECD, we see that across all developed countries, all 34 countries in the OECD, trust is eroding, and in 24 of those, it's eroding very rapidly. And we can talk perhaps more in questions about what's eroding that trust, but certainly if you think about just the issue of transparency, WikiLeaks, the Snowden revelations, the Panama Papers, one of the drivers is a deep sense that what governments are doing is looking after the interests of a very small group at the very top of the system. And I think the worrying thing for governments is the data that comes out, if I just think about the United States and Britain, that the top quintile, or even just the top 1% in the United States, not only have a larger and larger share of wealth and income, and not only is there a wider gap than there's ever been, but it's increasing in Britain 3 times faster. The income and wealth of that top quintile is increasing 3 times faster than any other group. And in the United States, it's not just the static picture of inequality, which the Peterson Institute depicts as scary, but it's the dynamic behind that, the acceleration in that inequality that becomes very important. And it's fueling this anti-establishment politics. If you take out all the people that go to Donald Trump rallies for the entertainment, and you've got to hand it to the guy, he's one great stand-up comedian. But if you take the people that are there because he's saying things not just that they want to laugh at, but they're saying things that they're listening to, you look at a whole belt of the United States where people not only have watched their own lives decrease in prosperity and well-being over the last decade and a half, but they cannot see any prospect of their children living better lives. And so, quite understandably, in my view, they're saying, if my choice is a presidential candidate who says, I'm going to try to tweak the system and make it a bit better, or one who says, damn it, let's smash the machine, what have I got to lose in smashing the machine? Now, the reality is quite a lot, but what I'm saying is it doesn't take a huge step of empathy to understand why the political system seems to be failing huge groups of people across the European Union, across the United States, across South Africa, across huge parts of the rest of the world. So why is it then, or what is it that governments are responding to these challenges with? What is the state of government as we see it? And here I just want to speak briefly to these 3 reactions, trends in some places in government. And the first is downsizing. And here the argument is government is not working because it's too big, or alternatively, government's costing too much at a time when commodity prices are dropping, the global economy is slowing, all governments are having to tighten their belts, and an obvious place to do that is by downsizing government. But there's some quite important lessons around doing this, and I think Britain provides a great case, and it's been written up by one of my colleagues in the Blavatnik School, Christopher Hood, and his co-author, Ruth Dixon. So they've looked at 20 years of efforts in Britain to downsize spending on government and downsize the civil service. And their reading is very sobering. It's quite dry, but the conclusions are sobering, because whilst these initiatives succeeded in reducing the number of civil servants in government, they ended up costing the government 40% more. That's a huge increase in government expenditure. So the government was undertaking a cutting of the civil service in order to try to cut the cost of government. It cut the number of people working for government, but increased the cost of government by 40%. They also have a measure of citizen satisfaction with government. And that measure of citizen satisfaction with government suggests that people became less happy with what government was delivering. So this is a sobering story of a government in a well-intentioned way trying to cut numbers and costs of the civil service and ending up increasing expenditure and, from their metric, reducing the quality of what government was delivering. So what's the lesson? The lesson is not that we should have bigger and bigger government. The lesson is that just as big government doesn't mean good government, nor does small government mean good government. If you want good government, you actually have to focus on the quality of people in government and the quality of the policies in government. And that simply to start trying to cut government without considering quality has these two risks, the one that I've mentioned, and the second risk is the risk that you get from trying to outsource when you do not have the skills and knowledge to outsource effectively. So what my colleagues in the Blavatnik School are documenting in different countries and in different sectors are efforts by government where government is not delivering well to outsource delivery to the private or not-for-profit sector. And on the face of it, that should be a promising avenue. The problem lies in how governments outsource. The rule that most of the private sector would give you is that if you're going to outsource, you have to know more about what you're outsourcing than the people you're outsourcing to. But of course, what governments do is outsource exactly the things they don't know about. And so we get to a huge, very ineffective, very costly model of outsourcing and a complete obsession with contracts and the contracting process, instead of actually focusing on the relationship and building a proper relationship, finding the right contractors and so forth. So the lesson on downsizing is that it looks attractive to a government, it's a way to deal with a fiscal deficit, but beware, it could cost you more and it could lead to much poorer government. The second reaction to against this background of challenges is what I would call a downgrading of government. And here I'm talking about a move away from the idea of a meritocratic system of bureaucrats and a move towards more and more political appointments and the politicization of the civil service. And I say this against a backdrop in Brazil where things might be changing in the opposite direction, which I think is an important and positive trend. Why? Because the global evidence, for example, that drawn together by my colleague Boo Rothstein in the Blavatnik School, tells us that the higher the number of political appointments you have in government, the more prone you will be to a government which is clientelistic, patronistic, that is not impartial. And that makes sense if you think about the intuition behind that. If your job as a senior official relies on you being appointed by somebody, and you know if they lose the election, you too will lose your job, you're likely to orient all your work not just towards their policy program, but also towards ensuring that they're re-elected so that you keep your job. But that, in a way, is the cancer in the system. Because then you start getting a system in which there is no check, balance, and space for impartiality in the system. So it's notable that countries that have real difficulty asserting impartial government, and think about actually lots of countries in this part of the world, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, the number of senior officials who change when a presidency changes, in all these countries, numbers in the thousands. The number of senior officials, let me give you a contrast, the number of senior officials in Denmark who change when there's an election which changes the party in power is, have a guess, anyone? Those who have been at the school would know, but it's 10. So there is a cost, of course, to that stability. Politicians will tell you with great frustration, if you watch the British television series Yes Minister, there's a sense that the civil servants who are there for life are just sitting there waiting for the politician to leave office and continuing to do the same thing. There's a good reason why politicians want to make political appointments. They want to make political appointments because they think that civil servants will stop them from their fantastic ideas. They want to make political appointments because they want loyalty. They want people who will protect their backs and do their bidding. But of course, as citizens under these governments, we need politicians to be checked in these impulses, because a government that is not impartial in the backdrop that I've described is a government that's going to be ever more prone to having people wanting to smash it, to having people, citizens, rise up in a belief that the government is not serving the interests of all citizens, but is simply serving the interests of a few. And that downgrading of government extends even to the international realm. You'll see that at the moment the United Nations is appointing a new Secretary General. The World Health Organization is appointing a new head. The World Bank is about to decide whether or not to renew its president. The IMF recently renewed Christine Lagarde as its managing director. Now, in these leadership contests, what is it that is brought to bear? Is this political tribalism? Is this, we want this candidate because they're from our country? Or are we actually applying meritocratic principles? In a report that I recently finished on the leadership of international organizations, what struck us in the research is that there are 6 questions each of you should ask when you think who should be Secretary General, or should we reappoint Jim Kim as the World Bank's president, or who should we have as the World Health Organization head? And those 6 questions are incredibly simple. You should probably ask them about most organizations. First, have they managed? Is there real evidence that they can secure and adapt the mandate of their organization? Or are they just peddling away with lots and lots of speeches, lots of priorities, but no clear mandate? The United Nations has thousands of mandates. It needs a Secretary General who doesn't just secure new ones, but who gets rid of all the ones that are redundant so that they stop spending so much time on them, paralyzed. The second, does this candidate for the leadership do we have evidence that they can secure funding for the organization? Not funding for one country's pet project, but funding for the core purposes of the organization. The African Development Bank, a couple of years ago, managed to double its capital, a great exercise in leadership. The World Bank, in that same capital funding, only got a 1/3 increase in capital. That's an important distinction. Third, do we have evidence that this head of the organization creates an operational plan and reports against it? Do they actually not just know what they're doing, but have they committed it down so that their organization knows? And are they reporting against that? Fourth, do they actually manage not just to attract, but to retain outstanding staff? Or under their watch, are outstanding staff leaving? And fifth, are they applying and enforcing ethical standards within the organization as well as in the work of the organization? Now, these are pretty obvious tests to apply to a leader of an organization. What's telling? I challenge any of you to find any evidence that any one of those 5 things, let alone all 5, are being applied as a test, whereas as citizens, we should have a right to have those nominating candidates tell us how they rank on these 5 things. Because a great leader can't make an international organization solve the world's problems, but the likelihood that an organization will do well is seriously undermined if there's poor leadership at the top. And we've seen that in every one of the organizations that I've mentioned, just at moments of international crisis, where we need those organizations act with absolute effectiveness. And that's why leadership matters. So this second point about downgrading government, it's downgrading the professional skills that you need in government and downgrading the professional status and cadre of non-political appointments. And I'm saying that that puts at risk the impartiality of government. And just as an aside, the impartiality of government is not just a nice to have. Think about why we actually need government in the first place. Why don't we just get rid of government? Why? Because every society in the world has people that have conflicting ideas, conflicting interests, conflicting cultures, conflicting values. And yet somehow they have to try to live together. And so we've evolved the idea of a government who can make rules so that people can coexist even when their values, their interests clash. For governments to continue to do that effectively, they have to be seen as impartial. And thirdly, and this I think is really important to integrity in government in the 21st century, is the alarming rise of leaders and political parties and politicians in established governments who are willing forcefully to erode the three core foundations of democratic accountable government. And what are those? The first is the idea of elected representatives governing. Elected representatives governing. The second, the idea of the rule of law and everybody, including the politicians, being under the rule of law and equally treated under the rule of law. And third, an idea so important to liberal democracy, the protection and respect of minorities. Democratic accountable government is not majoritarian rule. So where do we see these eroding? There's some pretty obvious examples around the world of where elected representative government is being eroded by fiddling elections, by fiddling constitutions, the idea that a leader's legacy matters more than their adherence to the Constitution. But there are more subtle things that I think are undermining electoral democracy, and I'd like to speak about one, which is the recent British referendum. Because a referendum was presented by the government as a way to consult the people. But this is not a good way to consult the people. A one-off vote, yes, no, is not a consultation. Consultation must be undertaken by government, and it must be undertaken thoughtfully and thoroughly if they're going to represent people. That's what representative democracy has to be about. So if a referendum is not a good way to consult people, then what is it? And I'd put it to you that a referendum on many issues, such as the one that was put to the British people, is a way for elected representatives to avoid taking responsibility for a decision. Once they put the decision to the people and they say it's for you to vote on the decision, who is it that takes responsibility for that decision? Are we actually giving politicians the opportunity to exercise authority and not take responsibility for the exercise of authority, but rather to say, well, it wasn't our decision, it was the decision of the people, and therefore we don't have to take responsibility for taking forward that decision. And that runs completely counter to the idea of representative democracy, which means that you elect a government and that government has to take responsibility for decisions and their implementation. And if you don't like what they've done, you can vote them out at the next election. So I think we're seeing both subtle and less subtle erosions of elected democracy. The second value that I spoke of, which is the rule of law, we're seeing eroded everywhere. We saw the erosions increase, I think, at an alarming rate after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. When politicians across the United States and Europe began to panic and say, well, no, we should give the police many more powers, we should give our surveillance agencies many more powers, forgetting or not aware of the 200, well, in Britain you could argue from the Magna Carta, from 1215, right through to the present day, the struggle to ensure that the coercive power of the state is not wielded without very significant checks and balances. Many politicians in governments across the world have little understanding that when they talk about loosening up this legislation or giving more power to this, whether it's to the police or a surveillance agency, they're making the lives of those law enforcement agencies much more difficult because they're creating shortcuts. In Britain, we saw this in the wake of the first anti-terror legislation more than a decade ago, where there were powers given to arrest and hold people who you thought might commit terrorist offences. And in Parliament, politician after politician eloquently argued that this would only be used when they really thought that there was a terrorist on the brink of committing an act of terror. Within a week of the legislation passing, there was an anti-globalization protest around a G20 meeting in the City of London, which led to a whole bunch of protesters running and throwing bricks at the windows of McDonald's and various shops. These were citizens committing criminal offenses, right? The police should have gone and arrested them for criminal offense. But that actually is a much more cumbersome process than simply shoving them all in the van and acting under the new anti-terror powers. And so we saw the very first application to a case which was clearly not terror, and you had sympathy with the police. They wanted to quell this criminal activity very quickly, and suddenly they realized they could do it without using their usual due process. So it was eroding the disciplines within which they work as well. But more recently we see, and we don't need to have a whole long conversation about Donald Trump, but to see a serious candidate for the US presidency encouraging citizens to smash each other in the face and that he will pick up. That's the crudest end of the spectrum. But the idea that it's okay for leading politicians to incite people to break the law, which we're seeing across different European countries in the wake of this wave of xenophobia hitting Europe, that idea is a steady erosion. It's a frontal erosion on the rule of law. So there's both the legislative weakenings and there's also the narrative of politicians. And third, of course, there is the idea that democracy is about the protection and respect for minorities. It is not majoritarian rule. Happily, I hope that that's not a crisis that you're living at this point in Brazil, but you can tell me in the Q&A. What I can assure you is that in the United States and across the European Union, it has become the issue. I don't know how many of you followed the burkini ban in France, where the mayor of Nice banned women from wearing full, it's a swimsuit that covers your head as well as your body. And they decided they would ban them from the beaches. Several other mayors followed suit. It led to that unfortunate episode of a woman trying to sleep on the beach with her head covered, waking up to find 4 police officers around her, ordering her to undress. So the coercive force of the state being used to order a woman from a minority to undress on the beach. And of course, there was a reaction to it across Europe. There were eloquent French citizens saying that this looked like Saudi Arabia, it didn't look like France. And the French court struck down the ban on bikinis. But it remains the fact that there are presidential candidates like Nicolas Sarkozy who are still advocating it in public. There is still mayors who are insisting that it should be applied to their beaches and towns. And it's at times like these when democracies are really tested on whether they really are about tolerance and the protection of respect of minorities or not. And frankly, we do not have a choice on that. And this is where I think that those people in France who are making this case are not taking into account the demographics that they are living in. If you look demographically at every industrialized country in the world, The demographic driver is that they will become more and more diverse. And the challenge for them is how to ensure that a diverse society lives together. In other words, to come right back to where I began, it's the challenge for which we created government in the first place. So integrity in government in the 21st century, in my view, does not need a brand new, let's get rid of all our ideas of political parties, of institutions of government and government itself. It needs us to pay attention to the ways in which integrity in government are being seriously eroded, and to think about how we recapture, how we innovate, how we work with private and not-for-profit sectors in our societies to build integrity in government, where integrity means government which is not corrupt. But it's more than not corrupt, it's impartial. And to build government in which the rule of law, the protection of minorities, and elected representatives actually take responsibility for what they do. So I'd like to stop there and hear from you. Thank you.
I don't know if it is working. It is. So if you do have any questions and you want to write them questions down, so we can pass to the people that are assisting us. I do have one question because I need some reassurance. Maybe we are seeing now in Brazil some people entering politics because they want to become the elected representatives to change government. But how can one keep one's integrity when the system is corrupt and when there's a lot of vitriol? So I'm trying to make a change, but then the system does not allow me. We're going to hear that a lot, and I see some people here coming in from different political parties. What are skills that we need to develop, or what should we, paying attention to? So if you want to make a change within the system, not just burning down and smashing things, but what does it take for everyone that wants to make a change to face this? Because it's going to be I'm scared.
Well, so there's a big difference between... Is this working? Yeah. So there's a big difference between countries where there's a very high corruption equilibrium and countries where there is a lower corruption equilibrium. And in very high corruption equilibrium countries, and I don't think Brazil is one, and I'm thinking of former students of mine who have joined governments where if you're not corrupt, then you cannot win the trust of the rest of your ministers who are all corrupt. So being corrupt is a way that they bond and trust one another. So I'm thinking of one student who has left that government because that was the choice. If you were going to work with others, you had to be corrupt because it was the bond that drew you all together. And I don't think that's the case in Brazil. Brazil, obviously, is in the throes, and has been in the throes for some time, of some very publicized corruption scandals. But that doesn't mean that there aren't whole parts of the Brazilian government, not just at federal level, but at state level and at city level, that work much better and much less corruptly. And I know that just from working with pockets, but you would all have a much more systematic picture of that. So what I would say is, if there's part of you that wants to run for election, if there's part of you that wants to work in the public service, do it. It will be the most challenging but potentially the most rewarding thing you can do. And what you will need to do before you enter public service or public office, but this is true in all countries, is to really know what's the issue on which you will resign. So not just to build your moral compass and know what your principles are, but politics always involves compromises. You can't go into politics with 500 absolutely unbreakable principles because you'll probably resign after day one. But what you can do is order those principles and know which are the one or two or three that are really important and why. And this is why at the Blavatnik School, for a whole term, these students who are here do foundations, they do philosophy to think through, to acquire a serious, rigorous way to think through these trade-offs and to work out what they really believe, which principles are most important to them. So I think the advice to think through what is your red line. If I'm going to join the finance ministry, what is my resignation issue? That's a really good practical way to focus yourself on how you're going to navigate through the occasionally torrid straits of public service.
There's another question here from Marcus. How can governments recover trust when public opinion no longer supports the administration? Is that possible? Possible.
Mm-hmm. So, and it's a question that governments all round are asking, how can they recover trust? And they live in a world where there is a great confusion about whether it's more important to be liked as a politician, to go on reality TV shows, to be known and possibly liked, or whether it's more important to be trusted, which is an age-old question of leadership. And of course, leaders who are trusted are leaders who are willing to take decisions for which they will not be liked. Now, you can go too far. Gorbachev probably went too far in his alcohol policies in Russia, where he became the most hated man in the Soviet Union, because governing a country of people, and the figures tell us there was extremely high dependency on alcohol, and removing that alcohol or taxing it so that they couldn't afford it was just one measure too far for the people over whom he was governing, even though his intentions were great. So I'm not saying you can do everything, but there is no secret new measure for winning trust. It's about politicians recognizing and being grown up enough to recognize that their job is not actually to be liked. And for citizens, and I don't think that citizens want politicians who simply want to be liked. I think that that's a belief that politicians are given by their campaign managers and spin doctors. And so they've become trapped in this vortex. But I think there is a way for politicians to win back trust.
There's a question from Marinelu. Where are you? Okay, over there. If you have any good examples in the world of government and systems of government that are actually working in a sense that they are protecting minorities, diversity, sitting under the rule of law, and also having elected representatives that govern, right? Mm-hmm. Got it all.
Yeah, and there's an article about being Denmark, which cites Denmark as this great example of all things. But my approach is not to try to find one government that does everything perfectly. In fact, in the Blavatnik School of Government, we start with the idea that actually, if you look at all countries in the world, you'll usually find that there's something that a government is actually doing pretty well. And that we've got to create an environment and a school and collaboration with schools like this one where we can learn from things that are working. Because, of course, academics have spent decades documenting the failures of government, which doesn't help build capacity in government. It's not very helpful when a minister calls you down to London to say, I need to solve this problem, and the academics spend 4 hours elaborating every single reason why everything will fail, when the politician is trying to do something that will work. So finding policies, finding practical measures that do work, but that aren't just anecdotes. And I think one of the things that the researchers working with us note is that a lot of the advisors that governments use, whether it's management consultants or advisors, are tending to just work with anecdotes. And that's quite perilous territory. And that what we can do, including all of you, is do what academics do best, which is really look comparatively and start thinking about, if that worked in that setting and it didn't work in that setting, why? And I don't mean try to do randomized control trials of every single policy. I'm skeptical of that approach because I think there's so much that we can do in learning from one another. I think back to a few years ago when Britain had a little scandal about politicians' expense accounts. Much publicised across the newspapers, and they decided to create a parliamentary standards authority. And I talked to the team that were creating the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, and to my astonishment found that they weren't talking to any other country. And they said they would love to, but they just didn't have time. And that's the truth of it. Most people in government are trying to resolve one crisis after the other, and they don't have time to go and look for other examples. So it was with great enthusiasm that we set up for them to speak to Brazil, to members of the Brazilian Congress and Senate. And because Brazil had a couple of years previously, of course, had a similar crisis and put in place measures to try to rectify the problem. And so too had Australia and Canada. And so we set up a conversation between the 4 different bodies where they could actually learn from each other's experience and say, oh, actually, if you're going to try that, we already tried that and it didn't work. So I'm afraid I'm not going to say copy Denmark in every single thing it does, because I don't think that works. I think there's good reasons why countries do things differently. But beware of believing that that every single one of your country's problems are unique. I think every single one of us, including me, when I first went to Oxford, believes that all other countries in the world are sort of similar, but our one country is particularly unique, which is why we alone can't learn from other countries, when actually there's a huge amount we can learn. And the main thing we can learn is not to replicate mistakes that other people have already realized are mistakes.
I'm going to combine 2 different questions, because here there's a question from Lucas talking about if democracy represents the will of the median voter, how can we prevent it to be the majoritarian rule that does not respect minorities, as well with
Who is Lucas? Can you put up? Thank you. Good.
And I'm combining that with no name, but anywho, if civil servants should be minimized, and efficiency is neutral, but the concepts of justice are not, how do political parties address different issues and different values? How can parties implement the policies? So combining with this median voter, so in order to avoid this majoritarian rule not respecting.
Yeah. Whose question is the second one? Right. Thank you.
Good. Yes.
I'll probably have to get you to remind me in a second. But so on the second question, I don't think you can afford to minimize your civil servants for the following reason. The kind of person that wants to be a politician is usually somebody who's quite verbal, quite communicative, and quite self-believing. And that kind of person has a lot of energy and drive, which is great, but they probably, in my experience, very often suffer from the belief that perhaps they're the first person to have this idea or solution. I don't know how many of you watched, sorry, but I find it amusing, the Donald Trump speech where he says, we're going to build a 50-foot wall. 50 feet, nobody will get over that. Well, they might use a ladder to get up. But, what are they going to do when they're at the top? And then he stops and he goes, well, I guess they could use a rope. But we're going to build the 50... And it's this... Or his reaction to Apple, where he said, well, we should all just boycott Apple. There, I just came up with that solution, he said. I just came up with that solution right here on the spot. Well, actually, he's a caricature, but he's a caricature of something that you see a lot in politics. It's great for people to have great new ideas, but you absolutely need expertise to say, actually, we have tried that. And of course, there are some academics who keep coming up with new ideas and not realizing that they've been tried before as well. And they also need that same discipline of people around who can actually be a repository of experience, of technical knowledge, of understanding, who can actually say, no, actually, we can't do that. It's against the law. Or, they might have ropes in Mexico, or whatever they're going to say. It might not work. So I don't think we can afford to minimize civil servants. But what we need are civil servants who are every bit as expert and entrepreneurial as the kind of people who lead in expert delivery in the private sector. And that I'm passionate about. On the median voter, which is Lucas, yeah. So I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
The design of democracy, the median voter which ends up
Yeah, oh, I see, yes. So here politicians are really important because politicians are not simply the puppets of voters. Politicians, probably their first and foremost responsibility is as communicators in chief. It's to create the narrative that a society lives by. It's to help a people understand who they are, why they are together, why they're working together. So the politicians that create a narrative which says everybody not like me is a threat is a very dangerous politician. And in fact, they shouldn't be in government because we wouldn't need government if we just wanted one group to set upon another group. I mean, that's why we have government, in order that those two groups can in fact work together, live together, conduct collaboratively whatever purpose they might or need to. So I think the focus group politician who's always looking at what the median voter believes and then replicating it and magnifying it onto the national stage is not doing their job.
Okay. We have so many questions. I organized one of them as a question here, but I'm sorry, we're actually closing, to our final time. This is an interesting question. What are the parts of government that you think can be substituted by robots?
Whose question is that?
No name. Oh,
Yeah.
here, Rafael.
Great.
Right.
Excellent question.
Well, especially if I proceed, in order to guarantee that the human questions in making decisions and protecting minorities will actually be, taken care of. So what are the parts that maybe technology can be a better government?
Yeah. So it's absolutely true that robots can help us to understand a whole lot of things about citizens that we wouldn't have understood, to put together the big data picture of what's happening. In a couple of instances where they're doing that, one is in my own country in New Zealand, where some early work on citizen analytics is actually saying something quite challenging, which is that the sort of national belief that there is great social mobility in the country is not actually true once you start putting the citizen analytics together. So this is quite powerful information for a government. But there's a big difference between or the distinctions that I think we now have to absolutely focus on are about what kind of data we're talking about. Because the aggregation of certain kinds of data which give us a clear picture of who our citizens are and what they are, what their circumstances are, is very different from efforts which are currently underway to use robots, for example, to make foreign policy decisions, where the input data is actually a whole set of very subjective judgments made by groups of experts. And the problem with using robotics at that point is how quickly, it's the same problem that social science has in using modeling, formal modeling, is how quickly researchers forget about the huge problems with their data. How quickly they forget that 40% of the data has been imputed using a different model, that it's not actual data. I recall years ago in a conference that I was running, watching a whole panel of economists argue over a chart which showed that the maternal mortality rate in Pakistan had been dropping. And they had this furious argument about whether it was aid that had caused this, or whether it was some changes in policy, or whether it was a change in government in Pakistan. And then this rather elderly former aid official at the back said, what data is, there is no data on maternal mortality in Pakistan over the period you're looking at. What's the source of the data you're looking at? And it turned out that it was all imputed, and it was imputed using a very crude macro model. In other words, the graph that they were looking at, just very in caricature, was really a graph of a kind of exchange rate movement that they were all arguing about. So this is important. It's important for us to keep hold of what we're actually analysing, because the lust for a certain kind of evidence can make us blind to what we're actually looking at. And the only other thing I would say about, I'm an enthusiast for using more data and more real information, because so much of the world of government and public policy is anecdotal. But the challenge is very often not about the robotics. It's about the way in which often academics present evidence to policymakers. So I think about meetings where there's the minister trying to make the decision, the academic comes in with 100,000 pages of excellent evidence and an hour of perhaps not scintillating, but really very important findings from that research. And then the minister sort of walks out, and one of the other politicians says, yeah, well, that's all very well, but my next door neighbour's son does the following in school and really enjoys it. And if you go back to that minister a day or two later, I can promise you that the only thing they remember is little Johnny next door who does such and such at school and enjoys it. And it's that very often becomes policy. And it's not the 100,000 pages. So that's, speaking to a research community, that's just about helping researchers take very serious conclusions and turn them into an anecdote which a politician can remember. So not take the anecdote and pretend that it's evidence, but take the really serious anecdote and make it into a story that the politician can remember.
We have to be more strategic, otherwise we get lost in the models, right? I think, yeah, excellent. There is a kind of combining question that regards to your opinion about personal responsibility. So how much we can expect that government takes care of us, or how can a political party improve the quality of its member and therefore their policies? And it's also about why do you think we are suffering this lack of leadership in government? In my opinion, they all come back to the quality of people, but in a sense, how can we improve the quality of leadership or of a political party when they're trying to run for office?
So how many people in this room belong to a political party?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. And this is a very politically informed audience. And the role that political parties play is, of course, very different country to country and culture to culture. It always amused me to watch democracy programs from the European Union and from the United States, because US democracy encouragement programs have always been about funding elections, because that's the US model. It's like the big election, the big campaign. And German assistance is always to build political parties, because that's the German model, these much more stable membership-driven political parties. So you get these rather different strands. So part of me says, yes, we need, one way is to reinvigorate political parties, but the other way is to look at how people are politically coming together. How is it that segments of your population, you know, the old, the young, the middle, how are they coming together on political issues that matter? And what does that mean for the way we start feeding in views? And I think that's pretty important. The other way that different parts of society have been represented, though, is obviously through trade unions. And that is something that has really changed in Europe, and in Germany in particular. The corporatist model has eroded. And with it, Germans would argue workers' rights have eroded. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. I think there's a lot you can say about the way in which trade unions had become closed shops run by sometimes quite corrupt elites and such like. But in some of the most egregious parts of the private sector today, that's to say, the private sector certainly if I take the British example, that are really attracting criticism because they're breaching all the kind of workforce norms, minimum pay legislation, etc. the unions used to play the role of actually holding those companies to account. And now that unions are not doing that, and workers are not belonging to unions, what is going to be the voice of the other social interests that need to be taken into account by firms? And I think that issue is absolutely with us. And the rising inequality figures and this huge anti-establishment politics which has taken root across the European Union. And it's not just Britain and the vote to exit the European Union. Look at the nationalist movements that have been voted into power in Poland, in Hungary, in Austria. Look at the only politician in France polling double-digit approval figures is Marine Le Pen from the National Front. The rise in Germany of very narrow nationalist xenophobic movements. This is something that certainly in Europe we have to take very, very seriously. And we can't exclude the economic and workplace issues that have arisen across all those countries. Why? Because that's one of the platforms of these very successful, very xenophobic movements, is we will do something about your place as a worker.
So that's a call for action for every single one of us here. That's our personal responsibility to take politics into our living room and discuss things and get into action, if I might say that. Because in this country, we are very polarized at the moment, and in order to rebuild it, we have to include the others in our speech, in our views. It's not only about minorities, in my opinion, it's also about my neighbor that has a different understanding of what happened 2 weeks ago. So,
but can I just say, sort of reflecting as an outsider to Brazil, so, you know, I was a university student when Brazilians were courageously overturning the dictatorship in this country. And of course, if you went back much earlier, as I mentioned earlier, there is this rich history of thinking particularly about the public sector and public service in Brazil. But this democracy is a young democracy, and what's extraordinary is how quickly and powerfully the institutions of democracy have grown and flourished in Brazil. And that's been because of a lot of effort, support, and thinking by Brazilians about what kind of government they want. So even during this whole process of impeachment, of the Petrobras scandal, of the other scandals, seen from the distance that I see it, what I see are institutions of accountability that are working. I see judges that are doing their job with a certain degree of independence. I see the Court of Auditors, you know, springing into action in some ways. You know, I'm sure there are frustrations in this room that they should be doing more, or they've overstepped their mark, or whatever. But given that the holy grail of government is government which is both effective and accountable, because the accountability keeps it effective in the right ways, even as Brazil struggles in this economic and political crisis, what is striking to an observer from across the other side of the world is that you've got institutions which are actually working. When tested to their limit, they are working. And that's pretty extraordinary for a country in which these institutions are so young.
That's the silver lining. So thank you very much for your participation in this debate, and thank you all for being part. Right? Thank you. I'd like to ask Mariana to talk about the Lemann program, about scholarships, and I think she'll be doing that in Portuguese, so we can actually send out. Would you like to ask a question to the audience?
Well, actually, all I wanted to say is that right from the first year of the Blavatnik School of Government's existence, so the school was launched in 2010, and I think it was probably as early as 2011 that we began a conversation with the Lemann Foundation, very much inspired by the view that there is so much that the rest of the world has to learn from Brazil, whether it's about industrial policy, creating new institutions, federal government, innovating at the city level. There are so many different kinds of lessons that other countries can learn from Brazil, that right from those first steps that my colleagues and I took to build the Blavatnik School of Government, we wanted to find bridges to Brazil and find ways where we could ensure that there were always experienced Brazilians in our classroom, prepared to share their expertise, that we had fellows of practice, academic visitors, that we found ways to help other countries understand Brazil's experience, and hopefully where Brazilians could begin to really understand the experience of other countries and bring it back to Brazil. So I'm thrilled that there are a number of MPP Brazilian students in the audience, and it's very much thanks to the Lemann Foundation, who were our very first partners and who have been supporting scholarships to the school and the Fellow of Practice. So I just wanted to say that by way of introduction. Thank you.
Bom dia. Meu nome é Mariana. Eu vou contar um pouquinho sobre a Fundação Lemann e os programas de bolsas que a gente oferece para brasileiros. A Fundação Lemann, ela é uma organização privada, familiar, que tem duas grandes missões. A primeira, que é transformar a nossa educação, fazer com que a gente tenha uma educação de excelência para todos. E a nossa segunda missão é apoiar uma rede de líderes que queiram transformar o Brasil. Para essa segunda grande missão, a gente tem a iniciativa principal, que é o programa Lemann Fellowship. O programa Lemann Fellowship é um programa que tem 3 grandes pilares. O primeiro são as bolsas, que a gente dá para 8 universidades no exterior. O segundo pilar é a rede. Então, aqui tem alguns Lemann Fellows que foram conectados em rede. Então, a gente acredita muito que essas conexões podem gerar resultados muito positivos para a transformação social aqui no país. E o terceiro pilar é o nosso apoio individualizado para os nossos líderes para a geração de impacto. Então, as nossas bolsas são direcionadas a essas 8 universidades. Então, além de Oxford, a gente dá bolsas para Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, Illinois, MIT, UCLA e Yale. O nosso foco principal são bolsas para pós-graduação, em educação, saúde pública, gestão pública, mas, além disso, tem algumas outras áreas que a gente oferece. Então, tem arquitetura e urbanismo, jornalismo, trabalho social, entre outros. Como que funciona nosso programa, né? Primeiro, o elemento principal é que as nossas bolsas são concedidas diretamente pelas nossas universidades. Então, a seleção inicial para passar na universidade é feita por ela, mas a seleção dos nossos bolsistas também. Então, todas as informações de prazos e formato de seleção é todo concedido pelas universidades. E aí os benefícios, como eu contei no começo, são as bolsas que a gente oferece para os nossos alunos, a inserção na rede e o apoio customizado para a carreira para impacto social. Alguns dos compromissos, né? A gente, na verdade, fala que os compromissos são elementos para explorar realmente os benefícios dentro do programa. Então, vai desde usar o seu conhecimento para impacto social. Então, ao contrário dos outros programas de bolsas, a gente não pede para devolver o valor investido, e sim que os bolsistas realmente dediquem suas carreiras para impacto social. Além disso, a gente pede para que os bolsistas contribuam para o crescimento da rede. Então, alguns estão aqui justamente para contar um pouco como funciona o programa Lemann Fellowship, reportar uma vez ao ano as ações de impacto feitas por esse fellow, publicar as informações no site. Então, hoje, quem quiser saber um pouco mais sobre o programa, conhecer um Lemann Fellow, a sua história, tem todas as informações no nosso site, e participar pelo menos uma vez ao ano dos nossos eventos. Bom, esse que é, mais ou menos, bem rapidinho como funciona o programa Lemann Fellowship. Eu queria convidar novamente a Patrícia Tavares para contar um pouco da sua experiência como Lemann Fellow e como Visiting Fellow na Universidade de Oxford.
Sério, para não ter que andar até lá, continuar também a discussão em português, eu acho legal esse formato. E esse é um formato que eu vi muito também lá na BSG, né? Todas as pessoas que vão falar, elas se colocam para dialogar, e é muito bacana. Então, o que foi pedido era um pouco assim: como é que foi ser um Visiting Fellow of Practice na Escola de Governo? Ai, foi incrível. Não, assim, porque tem algumas coisas que não precisa nem de muito esforço, né, para falar por que vale a pena. É um centro de reverberação de gente pensando há 1000 anos. É muito antigo, muita gente bacana fazendo coisas incríveis, além das tradições. Mas a Escola de Governo tem uma das características que mais acho que bateu o fundo aqui, como alguém que vem da área também de gestão pública e de políticas, né, públicas, de policy making. É o slogan: A world better led, better served and better governed. Então, se tem alguma coisa que foi absolutamente marcante na minha experiência, foi ter passado por esta vivência, é uma vivência, de conviver com uma pessoa como a Ngaire Woods, ouvindo ela falar, no dia seguinte ao Brexit. Ngaire, I'm going to talk about the day you convened everybody from school and discuss what happened after the Brexit vote. E o que me chamou a atenção? I'll tell you later. But again, well, she invited everyone, right? E a pergunta era, e agora? E agora o que vai acontecer? E agora quais são as consequências, o que você vê? E eram alunos do mestrado, alunos de doutorado, faculty member, as 2 recepcionistas e os caras da manutenção. Isso é servir. Isso é liderar para servir. Aquilo pode parecer pouco, mas marca uma mudança de modelo mental. Nós estamos juntos para pensar o que vai acontecer no nosso país. Então, eu acredito que passar por esse processo, seja você da área de educação, eu fui lá para fazer uma parte de, eu chamo de reflexão e sistematização do que eu faço como practitioner na área de educação e política de educação. Então, acabei escrevendo um policy note sobre a importância da liderança nas escolas, a importância dos diretores e supervisores de ensino, porque eu acredito que a gente só muda um país se tiver uma rede de ensino que entregue qualidade, não experiências individuais em sala de aula. Mas, assim, como é que você sistematiza isso? Como é que você eleva o nível da conversa para discutir que a gente não precisa só de laboratórios de experiência em sala de aula, mas a gente precisa de sistemas que entreguem qualidade de aprendizagem, né? Em escala, que é o grande desafio. Então, passar por ali. Eu participei, onde eu pude, eu acabei me enfiando. Então, assim, dando cursos num programa que eles tinham com Hong Kong, tem uma conferência que chama Challenges of Government, onde todas as discussões que são importantes acabam também trazendo um pouco de luz. Então, você se envolver com a parte profissional, com uma rede de professores e de fellows e de estudantes de quantas nacionalidades, Jussara? 50 e tantos? Obrigada. 55 nacionalidades. Vamos falar sobre qual é o sistema de governo melhor. Você percebe, não tem um modelo formatado, né? Então, esse tipo de espaço eu acho necessário para quem pensa governo, quem pensa atuar para fazer mudança de verdade. Então, eu sei que existem vários Lemann Fellows que são da área de educação, vêm da área de saúde, vêm de medicina, mas, especialmente, a Blavatnik tem um lugar que é muito precioso para trocar essa experiência e não para copiar modelos. Porque acho que uma das coisas que eu ouvi também da Ngaire tem experiências diferentes. E a gente tem que descobrir qual é a que se adequa melhor ao nosso contexto, porque nós não teremos o tamanho da Dinamarca, nós não teremos a educação da Finlândia, a gente precisa descobrir um tamanho de resposta que caiba no nosso contexto. O lado bacana, que tem a ver com o pessoal e não necessariamente com a parte profissional e o que aprendi, ou as aulas que eu fiz com a ex-ministra de Educação de Israel, que implementou uma mudança incrível, a gente vai trazer ela para o Brasil em algum momento, foi pessoal. Eu acho que aqui também tem um ganho que é importante falar quando você vai para fora, porque eu consegui perceber a importância de você estar em equilíbrio para poder servir os outros. E ter uma qualidade de vida, com tempo para a família e com condição de sair às 6 da tarde, sem se sentir culpado do escritório, vocês estão me ouvindo? 6 da tarde, e falar, estou bem, deu foco, funciona. Para poder querer servir o outro, você tem que estar com energia disponível para isso também. Tem sido o meu desafio, depois que voltei, de falar, esse espaço de Oxford tem que estar na minha vivência aqui em São Paulo. E esse é o desafio também, né, de como é que você garante foco, a qualidade da sua energia na troca e prestar atenção em que maneira a gente pode individualmente contribuir para um sonho comum. Eu acho que aqui é um convite de vem sonhar um Brasil melhor para fazer a coisa amanhã. Não é daqui a 10 anos, não. Tá bem? Se a gente tiver mais perguntas, a gente vai seguir lá para o foyer, porque temos agora comidinhas, conversas, e quem tiver interesse em saber mais, tanto da experiência como Fellow of Practice, ou mesmo para quem fez a MPP, ou mesmo dos programas de bolsa, eu acho que pode ser bem bacana. A gente vai ficar aí pela próxima hora. Muito obrigado de novo por vocês terem vindo. Espero que tenha sido inspirador e que mobilize vocês para o próximo passo. Ok? Muito bem, vamos lá. Quem são? So the MPP students. O João, que está ali. Quem está aqui? Guilherme. Bruno. Jussara. Outros Lemann Fellows presentes? Eu. E a Ju. Julinha.